So it's really an interesting story on how I came to M&A, Michigan Nonprofit Association. I had no idea at all what Michigan Nonprofit Association did or who they were, let alone where they resided in Lansing and the Detroit office. So I was told about the opportunity to be the director of the Metro Detroit Partnership Office, and I was told several times, and I said, well, that sounds interesting. I don't know if that's for me. But I happened to be in a meeting in United Way, and I was sitting there. We were all trying to figure out how to solve a problem around children who needed food. And these children were individuals who had very low wealth, and they were in schools and they were hungry, but they weren't getting food because they didn't want to be ostracized by being the ones who needed food. So we were all sitting in this United Way meeting in Detroit, and we figured out, let's give every child food. Let's not ostracize any child. Let's give every child food. And therefore, a child could feel free about getting the food that they needed. And that just gave me such a rush when we came to that idea, and it was fabulous. And I said, wow, this is great. I could do this all day long. I could solve these problems all day long. And the person sitting next to me was Penny Baylor, who at that time was leading City Year. And she said, you need to work for me. And I said, did I say what I was thinking out loud? And she said, you absolutely did. And I said, wow, I never thought about working in the nonprofit sector. At the time, I was working in banking, and I was there serving in the capacity of a bank person on a committee, and never thought that I could actually have a career really in the nonprofit sector. Long story short, really, I got connected to a executive search firm, DHR International, through a friend that also heard me blurt out, I want to solve these problems. And she said, Donna, I'd like to introduce you to Sid Kinney. And Sid Kinney actually decided to meet with me. The three of us, myself and another person, we were all going to meet, but that person couldn't make it. So I'm in this conversation with this executive search firm, not knowing that they're going to be interviewing me for a position. And lo and behold, she was absolutely doing that. And she actually made me think about my whole life in banking for 20 years and giving that up for something, for a career based on a feeling that I had. And it was very scary, because I worked in the bank for a lot of years, and just the proposition of leaving all that and going into a sector with an organization called Michigan Nonprofit Association that I'd never heard of. What would that mean for me? What would that mean for my family? I was also going to be married soon, and I had to tell my fiance then, I'm looking at changing my career. Was that okay before we get married? And he said that certainly that's fine, follow your dreams. And I was lucky enough to meet at that time the president and CEO, Kyle Caldwell. And he interviewed me because there was a process that was already in process. And he interviewed me, and they stopped the process to let me come into the process, which was amazing, but also scary, because then it forced me to make a decision. It forced me to make a decision to leave everything I knew behind to something that I didn't know at all. And I made that decision. It's been the best decision, I think, of my life. It's been the hardest decision and the best decision of my life, and that's what really brought me to Michigan Nonprofit Association. So Michigan Nonprofit Association, I think now today, and even 25 years ago, still is the voice of the nonprofit sector, still is the place that nonprofit organizations come to for resources, for tools to make their work stronger and more effective. We're still that place. I think what's happening now, as I see it today, is that the environment has changed quite a bit from 25 years ago. So while the need is still the same in terms of the basic need of helping nonprofits advance their mission, now it seems that the environment has changed, and they're looking for maybe additional tools and resources, new things to help them do their jobs more efficiently. And so we find ourselves now trying to understand in a very deep way, what are some of the newer ways now that nonprofits can advance their mission that may be different from what we've known for a very long time? So that's the excitement, but that's also the challenge. So I would say capacity building, and that's really providing tools and resources to organizations. Is something that M&A does and still does to provide services to nonprofits. I would also say our civic engagement work is something also that we do around volunteerism and service. Certainly those things are very integral to a nonprofit getting their work done and advancing and solving some of the complex challenges that they have. Also, public policy and advocacy, that remains and will probably forever remain a real key need for nonprofits that Michigan Nonprofits Association fulfills for them. I think I had just a tiny slight advantage because although I worked in the banking sector before, I was over the investments that we made, the grant making that we did from the bank. And so I did know some pieces of the infrastructure, actually just one piece. I didn't know Michigan Nonprofit Association, but I knew the Council of Michigan Foundations. But I was very limited in my thinking in terms of what they actually did and how far-reaching Council of Michigan Foundations was as it related to its partnership with Michigan Nonprofit Association, and had no idea about the Michigan Community Service Commission. So right away, when I became the director of Metro Detroit Partnership, then my boss, Kyle Caldwell, actually connected me to those particular organizations right at the very beginning. And so there was a lot of history that I received, and I could receive history from the executive assistant to the president at that time, to anybody who wanted to talk to me. I talked to them about that, so I was aware of it, but I didn't recognize how deep it was, and I didn't recognize how strong it was, and I certainly didn't recognize how we were admired by many across the country, which I thought was very refreshing, and then something that I could be really proud of. So when I see other organizations across the state, and I have a great opportunity to see that, and they ask me, so tell me about all this that's happening in Michigan's infrastructure in Michigan. And so I tell them that it is the sense of understanding that it takes grant makers and grant seekers working together to really affect the change that we all want to see, and that very partnership has to exist. And we figured out a way many years ago, well before I came into the sector, that was figured out for us to really to be able to do great work in Michigan. And so for me, it was interesting going across the country and recognizing that this didn't exist in other states, where the grant makers and the grant seekers were so far apart, and they were so challenged in terms of advancing the work that they wanted to do, whether it was in the public policy space or it was in strengthening the sector in order for nonprofits to get what they needed. It was very challenging for that to occur. But in Michigan, it's a conversation. It could be a conversation right at our board table at the Michigan Nonprofit Association, because we've got the Council of Michigan Foundations right on our board, the president and CEO there, Rob Collier, and then we have Jenna Holmes at the Michigan Community Service Commission right there at our board table. So when we're talking about things that need to occur in Michigan or things we want to see happen, or if we just want to talk about our imagination on how we can make the state better, we can do that right at our board table. And so that's very different, and it's such a huge advantage, I think, comparatively to any state that I've been to when I talk about it. Infrastructure knowledge that I had when I first came in was very, very limited, and certainly over time it's evolved, and it's evolved into to understanding the strength of our partnerships, the very basic notion of together we're stronger than we're doing our work independently. I mean, that just rings so true in terms of the work that we've been able to accomplish together. And so I never feel like I'm alone in this work. I feel like I can call someone at any one of the organizations, certainly the Johnson Center with Kyle Caldwell being there. Also, Jenna Holmes, we work very closely together, probably on a more regular basis. And of course, when we look at public policy, we can always tab Rob Collier at Council of Michigan Foundations, and we get the answers that we need, and we can move and act very quickly. And so I think now it's more of an asset than I think I thought of it from the very beginning. Before it was like, so we've got these partners here, and we're supposed to work together, and we do great things, and we've done great things in the past, but now it's about the future and what we can do together, and recognizing that we understand each other's assets and our personal attributes that we bring to it, and it's not as elusive as it was in the beginning when I'm trying to figure it all out. Now, I can't say that I figured out everything, but I can tell you that together I know that we're stronger, and together I feel very hopeful about the work of Michigan Nonprofit Association in particular for its future because of the infrastructure. It's very very interesting when we have new colleagues to come on board and we talk about, so what is this Michigan infrastructure? Actually, we don't talk about it in the sense of infrastructure, understanding that's exactly what it is, that it is the strength that actually supports the philanthropic sector in Michigan. We understand that, but we talk about it in the sense of partnerships. These are our partners, is how we describe that. And I think colleagues understand that language. Sometimes it becomes a little bit difficult to say, so who does what? And sometimes the lines are blurred in terms of who owns it. And that's where the personalities come in, because if you have that relationship, that personal relationship, and it might be some dissonance that exists, but you can call the person and say, I think this is where I should be leading, maybe you should be following here. And so sometimes when the lines get blurred, when there's a complicated issue, let's say, and we all have some stake in it, sometimes it makes it very challenging to tell a new colleague who's saying, hey, I should be doing this work. And you say, well, we actually collaborate on this, and we come to a conclusion from a collaborative perspective. Sometimes that can be challenging to explain that to a new colleague because they want to know, why can't I just do that? But other times they step back and I provide as much detail and information around things that have happened in the past, and then really explain to them that in order for us to move past or to solve challenging problems out there, that it requires us to step back, all of us, all partners, and then to really think through how do we work together to address that. And then the resolution might be that it's not Michigan Nonprofit Association, and that's okay. And so sometimes that's harder. And a lot of times, too, if you've got a new colleague that's coming in and they want to be the best at their work, and they don't necessarily know what the landscape is, it becomes a learning opportunity to share with them how we can accomplish things and how we can really be better at our work when we're working together. And so it's really, you really, when you're onboarding a new colleague into Michigan Nonprofit Association with this infrastructure, it's not a one-day orientation around here's what the infrastructure you work in. This is a constant, ongoing, and even for myself sometimes, an ongoing exploration of the infrastructure, which I think is pretty exciting. Right now, and especially in Michigan, there are a lot of things that can tell you about the physical infrastructure and why it's important. And at this point in time, if a funder were to ask me, why is it important to fund the infrastructure of a nonprofit organization, I will talk about what's happening in Flint and say, look at where a failed infrastructure is done to a community. That's exactly the same philosophy as it relates to the infrastructure for the nonprofit sector. And so if you're not investing in a nonprofit being strong to handle some of these issues, these big, complex issues that we see, that we all want to see solved. We know that the private sector can't do it on its own. We know that the public sector desires to do that, cannot do it. Then it's that middle part there, that independent or that social sector that picks it up. But they only can pick it up if they're strong. And so they have to have a strong foundation, a strong support system to allow them to do that so they can do their work. They shouldn't have to think about all the HR issues that happen with management of a nonprofit, or the financial issues, or even to think about all these pervasive laws and legislation that impacts their work. They should be able to focus on their work. And in order to do that, there has to be a strong infrastructure organization that supports that for them. The Michigan Nonprofit Association does that. So when you're looking for a return on your investment, funder, and you're looking for investing in a grant to allow a nonprofit to solve these challenges, and you want to take off as much barrier of that investment, then you would invest in Michigan Nonprofit Association to do that. It gives you much higher return on your investment, and it keeps that likelihood of solving the problems that you want to see solved completed because of that. So servant leadership for me, as a lead person at Michigan Nonprofit Association, really means there is an opportunity for us to support the leadership of others to move things forward, and it's not necessarily Michigan Nonprofit Association that's leading that, or certainly not Donna Murray-Brown that's behind or leading something out in front. It really is the ability to be able to provide the support system for someone else or something else to advance itself. And it's not necessarily looking to make a statement for itself for the notion of that, but it's really around how do I create the opportunity for others to thrive. whether it be other organizations, other people, and that's something that Michigan Nonprofit Association is proud to do. There's certainly lots of things that we can say that we had our hand in, but it's not necessary to do that. Really, our gratification comes from knowing that we still have the ability to support even more and more organizations, more and more communities from the work that we do, and we're satisfied in that. I would say one of the examples of servant leadership that Michigan Nonprofit Association had really the privilege, I think, and honor right here in Michigan has been in the city of Detroit with the Belle Isle Park Conservancy that now we're all enjoying, which was an opportunity to support 4 organizations coming together to really create a strong park for everyone to enjoy. And Michigan Nonprofit Association was that organization that supported those conversations to come to fruition to create this entity. And so while we were the ones that created the meeting space for them, organized their thoughts for them, helped them to organize their thoughts, I might add, and to help create a vision for what we are able to see and enjoy today as the Belle Isle Park Conservancy. It is something that we got complete joy out of to support the 4 other organizations creating their dream of what would be a park now that we know today that everyone can enjoy. So there was a lot of support that was given there, but it was not something that we said we want to create the Belle Isle Park Conservancy. Certainly we could have done that. We had the skills to do that, but it was necessary for us to be the support in providing the 4 organizations who have been working with the Belle Isle Park for many years, and some over 40 years have been working with the park and now creating this opportunity for the park to thrive. And we had something to do with that. So I think that one of the pieces of infrastructure that we often don't talk about is the infrastructure into people. And people make institutions and make organizations run and do the great work that they do. So one of the things that we're doing currently at Michigan Nonprofit Association is leadership with purpose. And it was really designed to look at that individual, to really assess and to imagine and to understand their leadership. And that is really, really important because oftentimes we don't have enough time or even the expertise or guidance to really explore what our leadership could mean in a community. So for us, it's really important to invest and provide that professional development and that space for professional development. And really, in some cases, like leadership with purpose, that guidance, that process. And it's really important now because as we look at the exodus of many leaders in the nonprofit sector, it becomes incredibly important to have a very strong pipeline of leaders like me that came from a totally different sector, or those that are in the sector that are emerging and moving through their career and having that opportunity to have inputs into their development, their professional development. That's something that we really value and consider really a function of our leadership for the sector. I would certainly say that it's a human capital strategy that we employ, but I would say that it doesn't start necessarily at the adult level. For us, it starts way in kindergarten and through our philanthropy education that we do. So for Michigan Nonprofit Association, we're thinking about leadership, we're thinking about children, all the way to young adults in college, and then we're thinking about those in community that can really think about their leadership in the space of community, however it plays out. We would certainly hope that it is in the nonprofit sector that they matriculate, but it also could be in the private sector or it could be in the public sector. But what we're really looking at is investing in the human capital from kindergarten on up to really create thriving communities. So that's something that we really feel is very important at Michigan Nonprofit Association. So I think that public-private partnerships are extremely important, and actually for me I was a bit surprised coming in because I saw a lot of the public and nonprofit partnership, but the private partnership didn't seem to be as strong as I hoped it would be. I think it's moving in the right direction now because much of the work as we look at solving challenges, the entities that are now emerging are very blurred. And so I'm starting to see that change a little bit. But I think in the public policy space, as we think about public-private partnerships, when we have the nonprofit caucus is one of those vehicles that was actually co-created at Michigan Nonprofit Association, and the Council of Michigan Foundations, having that entity there to really be able to understand the needs of the nonprofit sector, and not just understanding but advocating also for the needs of the nonprofit sector has been, I think, one of the greatest examples of a public and private partnership with the nonprofit sector. And so some of those partnerships, we can see some advancement as it relates to public policies that we've been able to either advance or in some cases stop, which has been extremely rewarding. And so I think as we can see those continue, I would like to see a little bit more as it relates to the actual private sector. And so still staying tuned with what we can do as it relates to that. And I think there are going to be a lot of opportunities in the future for that. The Michigan infrastructure, I certainly see ways that we influence the national, on a national basis. One of the key things that probably typically doesn't come up, and I think it's remarkable that it really is very strong in the Michigan infrastructure, is around diversity, inclusion, and equity. It's something that we have really created as a value here in Michigan, the infrastructure in Michigan, where we are moving forward, My Brother's Keeper, through the Commission, Michigan Community Service Commission, where we're looking at creating toolkits for nonprofits to use, where we have the Council of Michigan Foundations that created Transforming Philanthropy through Diversity and Inclusion. So we were early pioneers here in Michigan, and that work, because it's been many years that we've been really investing in it and ourselves and advancing that now we're informing the national organizations like the National Council of Nonprofits to take a look at what is the importance of diversity, inclusion, and equity from a national perspective. And I think that's been extremely, extremely rewarding. If I'm looking at conversely, from the national informing the Michigan infrastructure, I think I see that play out a lot in federal legislation that's occurring, where because they are located in D.C., many of the national organizations are located in D.C. by virtue of geography. They have the ability to find out things maybe sometimes a little earlier than we are. Also, to be able to advance some of the ideas and perspectives and opinions that we have in Michigan there in D.C., and that's been very, very extremely helpful. And while they're national partners that we have through our Michigan-based infrastructure, the relationships are so advanced and so strong because we constantly keep in contact with one another. Whether it certainly is mostly virtually, but we also organize ourselves both at the state level and at the national level, and that seems it's very seamless. And that's been, I think, exceptionally something to brag about, actually. So I think the things that are maybe sometimes difficult about infrastructure is that it's infrastructure. It's so strong. It sometimes seems permanent, and that it's not as easily to evolve. It's not as easily to see the need to evolve, because it's sometimes invisible until it breaks, or until something tragic happens, and then you say, oh gosh. Where was Michigan Nonprofit Association when we had all these nonprofits not being able to advance the work that they're trying to accomplish? And so that's when it becomes very easy to understand, and the need for it seems very, very evident. But if it's not changing with the times are evolving, and it doesn't have to be a tremendous change, but just evolving itself around as time changes and the needs change. And so just like we watched television, we have the big televisions and now we have the flat screens. It evolved. It's still a television. So the infrastructure is still there, but it's evolving and changing to the needs for what the community needs. And so I think sometimes it's a little hard to make those adjustments. Sometimes they're painful, but I think they're necessary, and I think that's what makes it challenging. What propels it, though, I think, is this notion that those, especially those that lead these organizations, are committed to the strength of the philanthropic community in Michigan. So it's almost a commitment. And no one ever raised their hand and said, I commit to this, but in their heart and by their actions that they've committed to that. And I think that's what propels that, because while there might be some challenges with understanding, some might be evolving a little bit faster than others, the idea is that we've all made a commitment to the betterment of the state of Michigan, and this infrastructure is included in that we will acquiesce when we need to, and we will move forward together when we need to. So I think staff need to know, Michigan Nonprofit Association, actually at every one of the organizations that represent the infrastructure in Michigan, really need to know its history. I think history is incredibly important because it informs really the future. It helps pave the way. I think also it's important for organizations, for colleagues, to be able to articulate what the roles are of each one of the infrastructure organizations and how they provide and give to the philanthropic sector in Michigan. I think the importance is really evident in terms of how you can see how we're advancing in Michigan, and really because it seems so elusive is that you really don't know how good it is until you go out of state. So I encourage all of my employees and team members, talk to others. All you have to do is go to one conference or go to meet any of your colleagues, and you can see how advanced we really are based on infrastructure. And so it really makes it much clearer in terms of why it's strong and why it's important. So that's typically how I share that with my team members. It's interesting because I came into the role and I followed behind a person who led the organization that's still part of the infrastructure. So I think that was extremely helpful for me. But I do often wonder if all the leadership changed at one time, how vulnerable would the infrastructure be? And so I think what makes our infrastructure here are the interpersonal relationships, because they exist and they're so strong, but it also is very vulnerable if things were to change at once. So I think about that. Or someone were to retire, or whatever the case may be, but if there were adjustments at the leadership, how would that work out? And so when I think about the past in terms of the organizations, everyone knew each other, and so there was this interpersonal connectedness, and it still exists, but it is always threatened and it's always vulnerable depending on who's in leadership. And it's part of the reason why I think it's so very, very important for those that work at every one of the infrastructure organizations to connect their colleagues and team members to each other, to the leadership of all of the organizations, because I like to think that we're always considering who we're grooming to take our role. I always hope that that's what we're thinking, because that's the highest vulnerability to this infrastructure we have in Michigan is the leadership. So I would say one of the things that from the interpersonal connectedness from each one of the organizations and its leadership in particular is that really you yourself can be vulnerable. And that has been exceptionally good for me as a newer leader, and especially in the nonprofit sector. It's been helpful to be able to go to any one of the leaders and really share, I'm having a challenge with this, or what do you think about this? Or someone calling me conversely and saying, you did a great job on that, that's fantastic. And just knowing that they're there has been extremely, even if you don't need to call them, you know that they're there. And that's been extremely helpful for me as a newer leader. And I would probably say also for my colleague, Jenna Holmes, too, at the Michigan Community Service Commission, also starting around the same time that I started as well, being able to do that. I also think that if there's outside of the infrastructure, outside of the organizations, when you still need to bring someone else in or you need to be introduced to someone, 9 times out of 10, one of the 4 organization leaders know someone or something to connect you to something that you need, and that's been extremely rewarding and important for me as a leader too. So I think it's a notion of understanding each other and being able to be vulnerable when you can be vulnerable, because leadership is a lonely spot, and leadership is a place that it's really challenging to say, I need help. And knowing that you do have a group that you can go to be vulnerable, I think makes us stronger, actually, which has been especially rewarding for me. There's lots of opportunities with our board, Michigan Nonprofit Association, because of the kind of the crossover of the organizations being represented also on my board and vice versa. Whether you're not on the board but you're a partner there's lots of opportunity to create stronger alliances from the board at the board level. And so and many of the board members of each of the organizations represent public and private sector representation. And so it really advances your network from the leadership of 4 to hundreds, really, of people that you have access to. And with that type of alliance, it really creates a strength in leadership that, to me, is second to none, and it's right here in Michigan. When I think about my leadership, the first person that really comes to my mind, and while I don't know this person extremely well, every interaction I've had has been one that has been inspirational for me, and I think inspirational for the sector, and that's Dottie Johnson. She is an extraordinary leader because she's a woman, leader in the field. Is somebody that I, naturally gravitated towards. But I think she's a smart businesswoman as well as a philanthropic heart, and I think so that it lets me know that all of that's possible, and it's wrapped up in this, this brilliant woman called Dottie Johnson. So she's one that I see that advances the network. The first person that comes to mind for me. I had the pleasure and the absolute delight to meet Russ Mobby, who is just a phenomenal person in so many ways, and just the foresight that he had to create Michigan Nonprofit Association, and understanding that there was going to be perpetual needs for the sector and that there needed to be an organization to fulfill those was just incredible. And the philanthropic education for children, looking at children and creating them at the, having them at the center of community is just exceptional. And I think today, with other organizations, still follow suit with that. Certainly Rob Collier, Kyle Caldwell, more recent legends, still alive, still doing well, still doing great work, but also taught me a lot and very patient with me, coming from another sector and asking maybe some dumb questions and answering those with respect for me, and that's been incredible, I think, as well. My vision for the nonprofit infrastructure in Michigan is that it continues to stay connected, but it also continues to look at other partners that could possibly be in that infrastructure. And so I think there are other organizations that can be certainly partners to broaden that. And I would like to see that it's so interconnected, that it is so strong that it can't be broken, that vulnerability of leadership will not be an issue, that it will permeate the entire state, and that either the nonprofit sector itself will be a force to be reckoned with. I think right now we're vulnerable because sometimes we're misunderstood, but the more that we broaden our tent and people understand what our work is and the value of that, I think that it will systematically be what it needs to be for Michigan. And so that's the vision for that. And so I think that Michigan Nonprofit Association itself will have a huge part, as well as the other 4 members of the infrastructure organizations that currently support Michigan will have a huge part in that, because we are clearly the ones that are informing lots of other people about what the sector is. We are still today talking about what does charitable mean. Still today we're talking about that. And so that notion of really being able to inform and professionalize, and I say that with all due respect because we are professionals, but I think some other sectors don't see us that way. So that as much as we can really create and demonstrate and broaden the organizations that are part of the infrastructure, and these could be, again, partners in that, we would really be able to raise the level and the profile of our work, not for the sake of raising our profile, but really being able to advance and solve a lot of these challenges that we have that can be done so if we broaden our notion of what infrastructure means, I think, in Michigan. Personally, as a leader at Michigan Nonprofit Association, in terms of creating this strong Michigan, this strong infrastructure, is really a legacy of being inclusive. I think that in order to broaden the infrastructure, it really looks at the entire state of Michigan and what makes up that, who makes up that, who should be included. I feel incredibly blessed and quite lucky to be in the role that I'm in. I did not grow up nonprofit. I came from Detroit, from an area in the community that was impoverished, really. And I find myself in a position of leadership and in a position to be able to impact a huge system of what we call the nonprofit sector, but from Detroit. Went to public school, and the first person in my family to graduate from college. These are the odds that you don't typically see in the role that I don't take my role lightly at all. And when I think about this notion of infrastructure, is who else gets the opportunity? Not just to sit at the table for the opportunity, but what skills and values do they bring, and being able to orchestrate that. So it's inclusive enough to really be able to make the change that we need to. And I think inclusion, equity, you could possibly say, you could say diversity, but I think inclusion is where I would really land for my legacy, because I think it takes much more than we have right now that are going to be able to solve the challenges that we're faced with now and in the future. One of the things that I would share with my colleagues and new colleagues is really easy. I could say, go to the website for our State of Generosity, but actually I would have to say that to some of my current staff members. Actually, I just said it today to one of you need to look at that website, our State of Generosity. For me, I look at it often. I actually go there, and what's wonderful about it is that you can just, almost like Google, just put a concept in the search field for what you're looking for, and something will come up. Lots of things will come up. So I think it's important that there is a resource that individuals can go to learn about that. And certainly the cast of characters might be different by the time that they get to that, but that's okay. It's really the understanding, it's really the knowledge and the history piece of it, but then also the future is also embedded in that. And I think that's what makes it such a great resource. And I would say, when I came on board in 2009, if I would have had that, oh my gosh, I'll be the most fantastic leader ever. I'm aspiring to be that, but that would have been, that's exactly what I needed. And so when I tell people about the philanthropic sector now, I have a place for them to land on that. But then the next thing I think is really making certain that team members, especially new and those that are existing, get a chance to fully understand by sharing stories with them, but then also putting them in the room with other organizations. And so they're not just in Michigan Nonprofit Association. It's important for them to know all the organizations, and I think that actually builds strength in our current infrastructure.